They laughed at his worn-out jacket. They mocked his scuffed shoes. Nobody in that glass-walled office building had any idea that the quiet man dropping his daughter off at the company daycare owned the very floor they stood on. To them, he was just another broke single father, barely scraping by, out of place in a world of tailored suits and corner offices. One woman in particular made it her mission to humiliate him in front of everyone, flaunting her title, her salary, her contempt for a man she assumed had nothing. She had no idea whose company she was about to walk into, and by the end of the day, she would wish she'd never opened her mouth. The moving truck pulled away just after noon, leaving Sarah Mitchell standing in the driveway of a small brick house on Maple Ridge Lane, hands on her hips, sweat already beading at her temples under the July sun. She hadn't stopped smiling since she got the keys. 3 years ago, this would have felt impossible. Sarah had spent 11 years in the Army, 2 combat deployments, and countless nights convincing herself she'd make it home in one piece. She almost had. A roadside explosion in her final deployment had shattered her left hip and femur, and though months of surgery and rehab gave her back most of her mobility, some days, especially long ones, her leg simply gave out, and she needed her wheelchair to get through the rest of the day without collapsing. None of that mattered today, though. Today was about Jake. Her 8-year-old son barreled past her into the yard, arms out like an airplane, weaving between cardboard boxes stacked on the lawn. "Mom, there's a treehouse next door. Can I go look?" She laughed and told him to introduce himself first, and watched as he jogged toward the white picket fence separating their yard from the neighbors, already waving at a boy his age peeking through the slats. This was everything she'd worked for. A quiet street, a good school district, neighbors who waved from their porches instead of speeding past with their windows up. After years of cramped base housing and a small apartment while she fought through disability paperwork and physical therapy, Maple Ridge Lane felt like the finish line to a race she'd almost given up running. The neighborhood radiated that particular kind of suburban perfection, matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, an American flag on nearly every porch. A woman 2 houses down brought over a plate of banana bread still warm from the oven, introducing herself as Diane before asking a dozen friendly questions about the move. Kids on bikes coasted past, calling out to Jake to come play once he was unpacked. For the first time in longer than Sarah could remember, she let herself believe things were finally going to be easy. By late afternoon, most of the boxes were inside, and Sarah had moved on to the one task she'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure: building the wheelchair ramp for the front porch. She could have hired someone. She'd priced it out twice. But between the down payment and closing costs, every spare dollar had gone into the house itself, and Sarah had built things with her hands before. Actually building it herself, board by board, felt like something she needed to do, proof to herself that she could still take care of things, still take care of her son on her own terms. She was kneeling in the grass measuring out the second support beam when she noticed a man in a crisp golf polo slow his car at the curb. He didn't wave, he didn't smile the way Diane had. He simply stared, first at the half-built wooden frame jutting out from her porch, then at Sarah herself, kneeling there in a sweat-soaked t-shirt with a drill in her hand. His eyes lingered a beat too long on the ramp before he drove on, expression unreadable, like he was already composing a memo in his head. Sarah didn't think much of it. Just a curious neighbor, she told herself. It wasn't until later that evening, while she sat on the front steps watching Jake chase fireflies across the lawn with his new friend, that Diane wandered back over, coffee mug in hand, and mentioned it almost as an afterthought. "Oh, by the way," Diane said, lowering her voice slightly, glancing toward the house at the end of the street, "you'll probably want to run that ramp by the HOA board. Gerald's pretty particular about dot modifications, just something to keep in mind." Sarah looked down at the half-finished frame beside her porch, then back at Diane's carefully neutral expression, and felt the first small flicker of unease settle into what had, until a few hours ago, felt like a perfect day. The first letter arrived 4 days later, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a water bill, and Sarah almost missed it entirely. It was printed on official Maple Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead, the kind of crisp cream paper that made everything sound more important than it probably was. She unfolded it, standing at her mailbox, Jake's backpack still slung over her shoulder from the walk back from the bus stop, and read it twice before the words fully registered. Notice of unauthorized structural modification, the ramp, half finished, still smelling of fresh-cut lumber, had been reported to the board. Under Section 4, 2 of the community bylaws, all exterior modifications required written approval prior to construction. Failure to comply could result in a formal violation, fines of up to $200 per week, and in extreme cases, a lien against the property. Sarah read the last line 3 times, a lien. On a house she'd worked 11 years and 2 deployments to afford. She told herself it had to be a misunderstanding. Surely nobody looked at a woman building a wheelchair ramp for herself and thought, this is the modification we need to worry about. So the next afternoon, she called the number listed at the bottom of the letter and asked, politely, if there'd been some kind of mistake. There hadn't. The voice on the other end, clipped, unbothered, explained that the board didn't make exceptions to the approval process, medical necessity or otherwise. If she wanted to keep the ramp, she'd need to submit a formal request, attach architectural drawings, and wait for the next scheduled board meeting. That meeting was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks. Sarah looked at her front porch, at the 4 wooden steps she sometimes couldn't manage on the days her leg gave out, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with money. She submitted the paperwork anyway, drew up the plans herself on a legal pad, photographed the existing structure, wrote a respectful, measured letter explaining her situation, the injury, the wheelchair, the simple fact that a ramp wasn't a luxury for her. It was the difference between getting into her own home and not. She dropped it off at the address listed for the HOA office, a converted garage 2 streets over, and shook hands with the man behind the desk, Gerald Voss. He was younger than she expected for someone who signed his letters with such weight, maybe mid-50s, wearing the same crisp polo she'd seen from her porch that first day. He skimmed her paperwork without really reading it, made a small sound in the back of his throat that might have been acknowledgement or might have been dismissal, and told her the board would take it under consideration. 3 weeks passed, no response. In that time, Sarah noticed things she hadn't before. The way conversations at the mailbox cluster went quiet when she rolled up in her chair on the bad days. The way Diane, so warm that first afternoon, started finding reasons to be busy when Sarah waved from her yard, as if friendliness toward the woman with the HOA violation had become its own small liability. The way Jake came home from a birthday party 2 doors down looking smaller than usual, and when she asked what was wrong, he mumbled that one of the dads had asked him if his mommy was going to get their house taken away. Sarah sat with that one for a long time after Jake went to bed. She wasn't a woman who scared easily. She'd carried wounded soldiers under fire. She'd rebuilt her own body from a hospital bed with more determination than most people spent on anything in their lives. But there was something uniquely exhausting about a fight that didn't involve enemy fire. Just paperwork, and quiet looks, and a system built by people who'd never once needed a ramp to walk into their own homes. The second letter came on a Tuesday. This one skipped the request for consideration language entirely. The board had voted, it informed her, and the modification was denied. Aesthetic inconsistency with neighborhood architectural standards. And she had 14 days to remove the existing structure or face escalating fines. 14 days. Sarah stood on her porch that evening with the letter in one hand and her other hand braced against the doorframe, her leg trembling the way it did on the worst days, and looked out at the ramp. 3/4 finished, sturdy, exactly the kind of thing that should have made this neighborhood feel safer, not smaller. That was the night she almost gave up, almost called a realtor, almost decided that maybe this dream had an asterisk on it she hadn't read closely enough. But then Jake came outside in his pajamas, sat down next to her on the step despite the fact that the step was hard for her, and asked, without any of the fear from the birthday party in his voice, "Are we gonna fight this, Mom?" She looked at her son, at the easy trust in his face, the assumption that of course his mother would fight because that's simply who she was, and something in her straightened. She thought about the deployment papers still boxed up in her closet, about the commendations, the discharge letter, the quiet fact she hadn't mentioned to a single neighbor because it hadn't seemed relevant to bring up while borrowing a cup of sugar. That 11 years in the Army hadn't just taught her how to endure. It had taught her how to read a chain of command, how to find the weak point in a wall of bureaucracy, and how to make sure that when she finally pushed back, she pushed back somewhere it would actually matter. The next morning, instead of calling the HOA office, Sarah drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association's governing documents, its full bylaws, and, on a hunch she couldn't quite explain yet, the deed restrictions filed at the community's founding 15 years earlier. What she found in those documents, buried in a section nobody on that board had likely read in a decade, would change everything about the fight ahead. But that Tuesday afternoon, as she carried a thick stack of photocopies out of the records office and back to her car, all she let herself feel was the smallest, sharpest flicker of certainty. Gerald Voss had no idea who he'd just sent a 14-day ultimatum to. The community center smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and every folding chair in the room was full. Word had spread fast about the wheelchair ramp controversy. Small neighborhoods thrived on exactly this kind of drama, and by the time Sarah wheeled herself down the center aisle, she counted at least 60 of her neighbors, packed into a room built for maybe 40. Gerald Voss sat at the head table with the rest of the board, flanked by a folder thick enough to make clear he'd come prepared to win. He didn't look at Sarah as she took her place at the small podium set up for resident comments. He was too busy conferring with the board secretary, the same clipped confidence in his posture that had colored every letter he'd sent her. Agenda Item 4, the HOA Vice President announced. Resident Appeal 4, 2 Modification Denial, Mitchell Residence. Gerald stood before Sarah even had the chance to speak. He'd clearly rehearsed this. He talked about precedent, about the sanctity of architectural standards, about how the board couldn't start making exceptions without opening the floodgates to every homeowner who wanted to skip the approval process. He gestured toward a printed photo of Sarah's ramp, blown up and mounted on foam board like evidence in a trial, and called it, without a flicker of hesitation, an eyesore that devalues the entire street. A murmur moved through the crowd. Diane, sitting near the back, stared very hard at her own hands. With respect, Gerald continued, turning finally to look at Sarah directly, the rules exist for everyone. Ms. Mitchell doesn't get special treatment just because her situation is sympathetic. If we let sympathy dictate policy, this neighborhood stops being the kind of neighborhood people paid a premium to live in. He sat back down, visibly pleased with himself, and gestured for Sarah to respond as if granting her a small, generous kindness. Sarah wheeled herself an inch closer to the podium and set the thick folder from the county records office on its surface. Her hands were steady. 11 years of learning not to let her voice shake in rooms far more dangerous than this one had prepared her for exactly this moment. I want to thank the board for finally giving me the chance to speak, she began, calm and even, because I've spent the last 3 weeks reading documents most of you have probably never opened. Specifically, the original deed restrictions filed when this community was established, and Section 11, subsection C, of the governing bylaws Mr. Voss just quoted from. Gerald's expression flickered, just slightly. Section 11C states that any HOA rule enforced against a resident must comply with the Federal Fair Housing Act, which explicitly prohibits associations from denying reasonable modifications requested by residents with disabilities. Sarah opened the folder and lifted out a photocopied page, holding it up so the room could see the highlighted text. A wheelchair ramp, for a documented service-connected disability, isn't an aesthetic preference. It's a legally protected accommodation. This board doesn't have the authority to deny it. Not under the bylaws you wrote, and not under federal law. The room went very quiet. I also, Sarah continued, reaching into the folder again, request the meeting minutes from this board going back 3 years. And in that time, I found 4 separate approvals for exterior modifications submitted by other residents. A pergola, a decorative fence, a paved side driveway, none of which went through the 60-day formal review process I was told was mandatory. All 4 were approved within a week. She paused, letting that land. One of them was Mr. Voss's own property. The murmur in the crowd sharpened into something closer to a gasp. Heads turned toward Gerald, whose face had gone the particular shade of red belonging to a man watching his own paperwork betray him in front of an audience. Those are unrelated matters, Gerald said, his composure cracking at the edges. They're not unrelated, Sarah said, and for the first time her voice carried an edge she'd kept sheathed until now. They're a pattern. This board approves modifications quickly and quietly for people it likes, and drags its feet, threatens liens, and hides behind the rules for the people it doesn't. I served 2 combat tours to earn this house, Mr. Voss. I am not asking this board for a favor. I'm informing this board that it has 30 days to approve my modification before I file a formal complaint with HUD for a Fair Housing Act violation. A complaint that, given the documentation I now have, this association would lose badly and at considerable personal liability to every board member who voted to deny it. Nobody in the room moved. Somewhere near the back, someone, Sarah would later learn it was a retired lawyer named Frank who lived on Maple Ridge for 20 years, said, quiet but clearly audible, "She's right. I remember when that fence went through in 4 days." Gerald opened his mouth to respond and found, for the first time since Sarah had met him, that he had absolutely nothing to say. The vice president, sensing the room turning like a tide against the head table, cleared her throat and suggested, in a voice noticeably smaller than the one she'd opened the meeting with, that perhaps the board should revisit the decision in executive session. Sarah simply closed her folder, thanked the board for their time, and wheeled herself back down the aisle, past 60 neighbors who were no longer looking at her like a problem. They were looking at Gerald Voss like one. The board's executive session lasted 11 minutes. When Gerald Voss walked back into the community center, he didn't return to the head table. He stood near the doorway instead, arms crossed, and let the vice president announce that the ramp modification was approved, effective immediately, and that the association would be reviewing its approval procedures to ensure consistency going forward. No one clapped. No one needed to. The silence in the room said more than applause ever could have. Sarah didn't gloat. She'd learned a long time ago that the people who needed to gloat after a win were usually the ones who hadn't been sure they deserved it. She simply nodded, thanked the board again, and wheeled herself out into the parking lot, where the summer evening air felt cleaner than it had in weeks. But the story didn't end with one board meeting. Word travels fast in a neighborhood built on cul-de-sacs and shared fences, and within days, half of Maple Ridge Lane knew the details, not just of Sarah's win, but of the pattern she'd exposed. Two other residents, emboldened by what they'd watched happen in that community center, came forward with their own stories. A young couple who'd been denied a request to install a small ramp-adjacent handrail for an aging parent. An elderly widower who'd been quietly fined for a garden bed the board decided didn't meet standards, while a similar bed 2 streets over, belonging to a board member's sister-in-law, had gone, unremarked for years. By the end of the month, 3 of the 5 HOA board members, including the vice president, had resigned rather than face a resident-led petition for a special election. Gerald held on for a few more weeks, showing up to increasingly sparse meetings with the same stiff posture, the same clipped authority, trying to act as though nothing fundamental had shifted. But authority, Sarah had learned in the Army long before she'd learned it on Maple Ridge Lane, isn't something you could simply keep insisting you have once the people around you have stopped believing it. Neighbors who used to nod along at his comments about maintaining standards now exchanged the smallest, knowing glances when he spoke. His own modification history, the pergola, the driveway, the quiet fast-tracking he'd apparently forgotten wasn't private, became a running, unspoken joke in every group chat and driveway conversation on the block. He resigned in September, citing personal reasons, and moved out of Maple Ridge entirely by the following spring. Sarah, for her part, didn't run for the board herself, not right away. She'd fought enough battles that year to last her a while, and mostly, she just wanted to finish unpacking the last few boxes still stacked in her garage, and watch Jake grow comfortable enough in his new home to stop asking, every few weeks, if they were going to have to move again. But the neighbors who'd once gone quiet at the mailbox now made a point of stopping to talk. Diane, sheepish for weeks afterward, eventually showed up at Sarah's door with a second loaf of banana bread and an apology that didn't need to be as long as it was. Sarah had never been the kind of person to hold a grudge against someone for simply being afraid of a system bigger than them. The ramp got finished the following weekend. Sarah's father drove up from 2 states away to help with the final railing, and Jake spent the better part of the afternoon supervising from a lawn chair, offering opinions on paint color with the seriousness of a much older architect. When it was done, painted a soft, unremarkable gray that matched the trim on the house. It didn't look like an eyesore. It looked like what it had always been, a doorway home built by a mother who'd refused to be talked out of the life she'd earned. 6 months later, when the HOA held its next general election, Sarah's name appeared on the ballot for the board. Not because she wanted the title, but because half the street had asked her to run, and because she'd realized somewhere in the fight that the rules governing a place only stay fair if someone's willing to actually read them. She won in a landslide. Her first act as a board member was proposing an amendment, unanimously approved, requiring every future modification request involving accessibility to be reviewed within 7 business days, not 60. There's a version of this story that ends simply with Sarah winning. The board backs down, the ramp goes up, the bad guy loses his seat, credits roll. And on the surface, that is what happened. But the deeper truth of it, the one Sarah would tell you herself, if you sat with her on that gray-painted ramp on a summer evening and asked, is that the fight was never really about a ramp at all. It was about the quiet, persistent assumption that some people simply don't have the standing to push back. That a single mother, especially one who needed a wheelchair on her hardest days, could be handed a stack of bureaucratic paperwork and a 14-day deadline and simply absorb it, the way so many people before her had been expected to absorb small injustices dressed up as policy. Gerald Voss hadn't targeted Sarah because he'd done any real research into who she was. He'd targeted her because he'd made a snap judgment. Modest house, a ramp instead of a paved driveway, a woman alone with a kid, and decided she was exactly the kind of resident who wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. Not because Sarah had some hidden fortune or secret identity waiting to be dramatically unveiled, but because he mistook her humility for weakness and her patience for permission. The 11 years she'd spent learning to read a chain of command, to find the overlooked clause, to hold her ground under far worse pressure than an HOA letterhead that wasn't hidden. It was simply invisible to a man who'd never bothered to look past a worn set of coveralls and a half-finished wooden ramp. That, in the end, is the part of this story worth sitting with. Not the satisfaction of watching a small-minded man lose his seat on a homeowner's board, gratifying as that was, but the reminder that the people we underestimate are so often underestimated for reasons that say far more about us than about them. A wheelchair doesn't mean weakness. A modest home doesn't mean modest resolve. And the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding the exact piece of paper that changes everything. Sarah still lives on Maple Ridge Lane. Jake is older now, taller, still occasionally offering strong opinions on paint colors nobody asked him about. The ramp is a little weathered these days, scuffed at the edges from years of use, but it still does exactly what it was built to do: carry her home, on the days she needs it and the days she doesn't, without anyone's permission but her own. So the next time you find yourself quick to judge someone by the car they drive, the house they live in, or the help they need to walk through their own front door, ask yourself what Gerald Voss never did. What don't you actually know about this person yet?